What I'm about to describe isn't from Marcus's debrief. This part comes from the surveillance logs recovered from Vorathi Public Record Archives, footage from the civic monitoring systems they use in their cities, which apparently run continuously and archive automatically for 7 years. Whoever decided to compile this for the diplomatic incident file did Marcus a service, because these images show something the debrief report doesn't capture. They show what it looks like when a city full of people encounters something it has never seen before. The footage follows him from 4 blocks inside the outer ring all the way to the administrative quarter, 12 cameras. You can trace his progress street by street, and what you see is people stopping. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic wave. Quietly. One by one, then in 2s and 3s, then in clusters. A street vendor who looks up from arranging her display and goes very still. 2 children walking with what appears to be a parent who take 3 steps past Marcus before they process what they've seen and physically turn around mid-stride to look back. A group of what look like workers on an elevated walkway who stop their conversation simultaneously and lean over the railing. Nobody rushes him, nobody screams, nobody runs. They just stop and watch. And then they follow. By the time the little procession reached the administrative quarter, there were easily 200 Vorathi trailing behind Marcus and the older man at a respectful distance. The footage shows them spreading across intersecting streets, filling doorways, pressing forward slightly but always maintaining a buffer, like a tide that advances carefully. Marcus said he knew they were following him. He could hear them, sort of, the soft displacement of many feet on stone, the sub-vocalizations that he now knows were constant commentary on everything they were observing. He said it was like being the subject of a nature documentary in real time. He said he was trying very hard not to show that he was scared. And he was scared. He told me that clearly. Not screaming running scared, but the deep, controlled fear of someone who understands their situation clearly and has decided that panic is the one option that definitely ends badly. He kept his hands out of his pockets. He kept his pace steady. He watched the older man who was leading him and tried to read whatever signals were available. The older man glanced at him once, about halfway through the journey, a quick, assessing look. And then he said something in Vorathi quietly that the surveillance audio picks up but that nobody could translate until later. What he said in rough translation was, "You are braver than your body language suggests. I can tell the difference." Marcus didn't understand it then. He found out what it meant 3 days later in the debrief, and he sat with that for a long moment before he said, "Huh." The administrative building was large. Not ostentatious. The Vorathi don't seem to build for show the way some species do. It was functional and precise, and it had the same old intentional quality as everything else in the city. Inside, the ceilings were high. The corridors were lit in that blue-white luminescent way. There were staff moving through with purpose, some stopping to stare at Marcus, some managing not to, some clearly receiving rapid-fire sub-vocalizations from colleagues about the situation. They took him to a room. Not a cell, the door wasn't locked, though a guard remained outside. More like a waiting room. There was furniture designed for Vorathi bodies, which meant it was the wrong dimensions for his, but he sat on the floor instead and waited. He was there for 4 hours. He ate one of his ration packs. He checked his communicator, still recording, still not transmitting. He read over the meager first contact protocol summary he had saved in his personal files, the one every hegemony explorer is required to carry, the one that was mostly useful as a reminder of everything he was already doing wrong. Then the door opened and the older man came back with 3 other people and a device that Marcus identified as a translation matrix. He'd seen older versions of them at hegemony diplomatic stations. The Vorathi version was different, more compact, but the principle was the same. You speak into it in your language, it builds a linguistic model, and then you can have a basic conversation." The older man sat down across from Marcus, on the floor, because the chairs were too high for a person-to-person conversation with Marcus seated where he was, and he held up the device. "Speak," he said, and then, a moment later, the device produced a rough approximation of the same word in what Marcus presumed was Vorathi. Marcus spent about 10 minutes speaking into the device, his name, basic sentences, descriptions of objects in the room, counting. The device recorded and processed. Then the older man spoke for a similar duration. They spent another hour after that building vocabulary. It was laborious and imprecise, and Marcus said it reminded him of being 12 years old and trying to learn Portuguese by watching old television shows. You got the shape of meaning before you got the words. By the end of that hour, they could communicate in the rough but functional way that matters when something important needs to be said. The older man's name, or more precisely, the closest approximation his name translated to, was Keithrin. He was what in Vorathi society would be called a senior voice, somewhere between a magistrate and an administrative official, responsible for a district of several thousand people. He told Marcus 3 things. First, the Vorathi knew what the hegemony was. They had detected hegemony ships passing through their outer system boundaries for decades. They had chosen, deliberately and unanimously, not to make contact. Second, no hegemony, or any other known interstellar species, had ever made contact with Vorathi territory. Their world was not on hegemony charts because they had specifically ensured it was not on hegemony charts. Third, Marcus had crashed inside the borders of the Vorathi sovereignty, which was the only nation-state on this world, which meant he had, technically, entered sovereign territory without permission. This was a problem. The problem wasn't punitive in the way Marcus feared. The Vorathi legal framework around accidental boundary violations was complex, but it included provisions for genuine emergency entry. The issue was precedent. Marcus was, as Keithrin explained with careful, measured subvocal-free clarity, the first member of an off-world species to stand on Vorathi ground. That meant it wasn't Keithrin's call. That meant it went up. Way up. Marcus asked how far up. Keithrin looked at him with those deep reflective eyes and said the word that the translation matrix rendered after a 3-second processing pause, as the Queen. Part 3, The Road to the Throne. I want to be clear about something, because the later reports tend to flatten this part of the story. Marcus did not want to go to the Queen. He said this explicitly. He said it to Keithrin, who explained it wasn't a request. He said it under his breath, walking down the corridor to the transport, and his communicator caught it. He said it again sitting in the vehicle, a ground transport, sealed, smooth riding, with windows that were either opaque or showing exterior views they were controlling. He couldn't tell, when he thought no one was listening. "I'm a Class C explorer with a crashed ship and no comms," he told himself quietly. "I am not equipped for a royal audience. I have blood on my sleeve from the landing. My boots are wet. I haven't slept in 2 days." He paused. "Gerald would love this," he said, and then he looked at the window. "Gerald, if you're archiving this, which you're not, because you're dead in a snowfield, I want you to know this is not what I planned." The journey to the royal seat of the Vorathi sovereignty took 7 hours by ground transport. They traveled through the city, out the other side, through a wide valley between mountain ranges, across a bridge over what looked like a frozen river, and into a different kind of terrain entirely lower elevation, dark forest, clearings that had been deliberately maintained. The sovereignty's administrative capital was separate from the city where Marcus had crashed. It was built in a long valley between 2 ridgelines, and from the transport window as they came down into it, it looked, Marcus's word, from the communicator record, like Someone who understood what a castle should feel like, built one from scratch without copying anyone. Not a fantasy castle, not spires and drawbridges, something heavier, more grounded, stone that looked like it had grown rather than been placed, walls that stepped back from each other in angles rather than rising straight, towers that were wide at the base, narrower as they rose, and topped with structures that held what appeared to be long-range sensor arrays or something functionally similar. The transport went through 2 checkpoints. At each one, guards in heavier armor came alongside and performed what appeared to be a scanning procedure, running devices along the transport's exterior. At the second checkpoint, they stopped for nearly 20 minutes while something was communicated and verified. Marcus sat quietly during all of this. He ate the last of his ration pack. He drank the water from the flask they provided him, clean, slightly mineral tasting, fine. He tried to mentally organize what he knew and what he didn't know, which was a thing he did when he was nervous. He'd told me this about himself once. When I'm scared, I make lists. Things I control, things I don't. Middle column for the stuff that could go either way. Things he controlled. His behavior, his tone, his hands, his breathing. Things he didn't control. The next several hours, the entire political situation, whether the hegemony would ever know where he was. Middle column, things that could go either way, whether these people were going to hurt him or help him. He said the middle column stayed uncertain all the way to the gates of the palace. Then they opened the gates, and the guards that came with him into the inner yard were different from the ones at the checkpoints, different armor, different bearing, different presence. These were soldiers in a way that the others weren't. He noticed it immediately, the way a person notices a change in room temperature, not by thinking about it but by feeling it on the skin. These ones have killed people, he told his communicator quietly. I don't know how I know that, but I do. They took his sidearm at the inner gate. He handed it over without argument. He'd have done the same in any hegemony facility, and arguing would have been both pointless and stupid. One of the guards took it with what appeared to be careful precision, holding it in a way that made Marcus think they'd been briefed on the type of weapon, which meant someone had either scanned it very accurately or had references they were working from. The knife they left, he found that more interesting than reassuring. Keithrin was still with him. The older man had traveled in the same transport and had spent a significant portion of the journey using a secondary device, a handheld communicator, from what Marcus could tell, sending and receiving information. His expression was controlled in that very Vorathi way, but Marcus said you could see the weight of the situation in the tension at the back of his jaw, a tell that Keithrin probably didn't know he had. Inside the palace, everything was colder than the city had been. Deliberately colder, Marcus suspected. Environmental control was precise in a way that suggested this was intentional rather than incidental. The corridors were wide. The ceilings vaulted higher than necessary. The floors were some kind of dark stone that had been polished to a mirror finish, and Marcus's boots squeaked on it faintly, which he was deeply embarrassed by and had no way to fix. There were people, staff, officials, he couldn't tell exactly, moving through the corridors, more guards at intervals. And every single one of them stopped what they were doing and looked at him as he passed. Not aggressively, not fearfully. With a quality of attention he could only describe, in the debrief later, as archaeological. Like he was something very old that had just been excavated from somewhere they hadn't thought to dig. He kept walking. He kept his hands visible. He kept his breathing steady. They stopped at a pair of doors that were very large and very deliberately ornate. The only ostentatious thing he'd seen in this entire society. And even this wasn't showy so much as weighted, like the doors were meant to tell you exactly how serious what was behind them was before you went in. 2 guards on either side of the doors. Not armor like the inner yard guards. This was something more refined and more severe at the same time. Marcus noticed details. He always noticed details. Boots with magnetic lock soles, subtle, but the gait was slightly different from normal footwear. Weapons at the hip that he couldn't categorize exactly, but that had the shape of purpose. Gauntlets that ran from wrist to mid-forearm, embedded with what he could now recognize as the same luminescent technology that lit the city's roads. He stood before those doors and he said, very quietly, to his communicator, "Okay, here we go." Part 4. The Throne Hall. The Throne Hall of the Vorathi sovereignty is described in the architectural records as follows: 400 meters in length, 60 meters in width, ceiling height variable between 20 and 40 meters due to the vaulted central nave. Primary construction material is indigenous black granite with structural reinforcement of a composite alloy developed in the sovereignty's 3rd century. Illumination is a combination of bioluminescent panels, grown, not manufactured, and focused aperture skylights that track the sun's position across the day. None of that tells you what it feels like to walk into it. Marcus walked in and stopped moving. Not because someone told him to, just because the space demanded it. The way some places demand that you stop and simply register them before you do anything else. The bioluminescent panels gave everything a faint blue-green glow that shifted very slightly, like the slow pulse of something living. The skylights cut precise beams of the pale exterior daylight down through the space, angled in a way that was clearly calculated. Specific points of the room were lit with deliberate intensity, and the throne at the far end was one of them. The throne itself was built into the far wall rather than sitting free of it. Stone grown up around and through something metallic, organic and technological in the same structure. It was occupied. The Queen of the Vorathi sovereignty. He didn't get a clear look at her from the door. The distance was too great. What he could see was a figure of significant height even when seated, wearing something dark and layered with a light source that moved within the fabric bioluminescent thread, as he'd later confirm. Her head was uncovered. Her posture was absolute, not rigid, not tense, but completely still in the way that only comes from a lifetime of learning that stillness is its own kind of power. There were other figures in the room, not a crowd, maybe 40 people total, arranged along the walls and in 2 rows extending from the throne. Guards, officials, advisors, all of them were looking at Marcus. Kithrin stepped forward and spoke, a formal, measured address in Vorathi that the translation matrix rendered in pieces, not smoothly. Something about circumstances. Something about emergency provisions. Something about the respectful request for the Queen's judgment. Marcus stood where he was and kept his hands visible and waited. The Queen said something. The translation matrix caught it. Rendered it. Played it in Marcus's earpiece. Bring him forward. He walked the length of that hall. 400 meters. He said later that those were the longest 400 meters of his life. That sounds like an exaggeration. I don't think it is. Every step echoed differently in that space. The stone floor was the same polished surface as the corridors, but somehow the echo in here was different, lower, broader, more present. His boots squeaked twice and went silent. He focused on the far end, on the throne, on the figure in it who was watching him approach with an attention so complete. He said he felt it on his skin, before he could see her clearly enough to read her expression. At about 20 meters out, the guards to either side of the throne came forward into formation, not blocking his path, just present, specifically, deliberately present. He stopped at 15 meters. This seemed like the right distance, not deferential to the point of being unable to communicate, not so close as to be aggressive. He'd done enough research on cross-species diplomatic behavior during his hegemony training to know that distance was one of the first signals you send, and that most sapient species read it essentially the same way. He looked at the Queen. She was looking at him. He struggled for the word in the debrief, and you could see him working on it, and then he said, present in a way he couldn't fully articulate. Like every sense she had was oriented on him and fully operational. Like she was reading everything, his posture, his breathing, his smell, the micro-expressions he couldn't control, and processing all of it simultaneously. Her eyes were the deepest reflective he'd seen in any Vorathi, almost black, with something shifting in the depth of them that might have been emotion, or might have been the bioluminescent light from the ceiling. She was older than anyone else in the room. He couldn't guess an age. The Vorathi aging markers were different from human ones, and he didn't have enough reference. But the quality of her stillness had decades in it. She studied him for what he estimated at about 30 seconds, which is a very long time to be studied. And then she stood up. And she stepped down from the throne, off the raised platform, and walked toward him. Every single person in that room went absolutely rigid, not with fear, with something more like arrested motion, like everyone was holding their breath simultaneously. The queen walked to a distance of about 3 meters from Marcus and stopped. She looked at him up and down slowly without pretense. She wasn't being rude. She was just looking. The way you look at something you have never seen before and may never see again, and you want to make sure you actually see it. Then she said something that the translation matrix caught clearly. And it played in Marcus's earpiece in a voice that was quiet and wondering, and entirely unguarded. "You're the first human I've ever seen," the queen whispered. Part 5, when the blades came out. What happened next? This is the part that the official reports cover most thoroughly, because it's the part with the most documentation, multiple surveillance angles, the recovered communicator audio, the testimony of every single person in that room. What happened next is the reason this file is classified, and the reason the diplomatic repercussions are still ongoing. But first, and this is important because context matters, let me tell you what Marcus did not do in the moment after the queen spoke. He didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He didn't reach for the knife at his belt, which was still there because they'd left it, and which at least 3 of the guards were tracking. What he did was look at her, at this woman who was a head taller than him, who was surrounded by armed soldiers, who was the absolute political authority of an entire world he hadn't known existed 4 days ago. And he said, very quietly, in the hegemony trade language that the translation matrix would render, "You're the first Vorathi I've ever seen too." A pause. "Though I have to say, I've now seen quite a few of you." And the queen, the absolute political authority of an entire world, blinked once. And then something happened in her expression that every witness in that room described differently, but that the surveillance footage captures with some precision. The skin around her eyes shifted. Her head tilted forward by approximately 15 degrees. The tension in her jaw, which had been very precisely controlled, released by a fraction. She was not laughing, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that in Vorathi biology corresponds to a form of involuntary amusement that the culture generally suppresses in formal settings. She hadn't suppressed it. She was, in front of 40 witnesses, almost smiling at a human being who'd crashed his truckship in her mountains. That was the moment the guards moved. Here's what the guards were reacting to, and I want to be precise about this because it becomes important later. In Vorathi court protocol, the queen does not approach subjects. Subjects are brought to a specified point, and the queen speaks to them from the throne or from a designated standing position. This is not ceremonial ego. It's a safety protocol built into the court structure over centuries. The queen maintains a protected distance. She does not close the gap. She'd closed the gap. And then she'd shown an emotional response in front of witnesses. This was not, by Vorathi law, illegal. The queen makes her own choices. But it was a significant enough deviation from protocol that the senior guard, a figure identified in the surveillance logs as High Guard Commander Verath, interpreted it as a possible sign that the queen was under some form of influence or compulsion. Specifically, that the human had done something to her. In hegemony records, there are documented cases of species that use proximity-based biological influence, pheromonal, subsonic, or electromagnetic, on other sapient life. The hegemony takes it seriously enough to have a whole protocol division for it. The Vorathi apparently take it seriously too. Commander Varath made a decision. He signaled. And the guards drew their blades. 12 guards. 6 from the wall positions, 3 from each side of the throne dais, moving to Marcus's position in a coordinated pattern that Marcus would later describe, in the flat voice of someone reporting a fact about someone else, as very well drilled. Not swords, not the kind of blades you're picturing. Longer than a knife, shorter than a sword, with a slight curve and an edge on only one side, a cutting weapon designed for close quarters, and the way the guards moved into position made it very clear they knew exactly what close quarters meant. Marcus had the pulse pistol. He didn't have the pulse pistol because they'd taken it at the gate. He had the knife. He did not draw the knife. He did the thing that, in the debrief, he said was the only logical thing to do. He went completely still. Hands up, palms out, don't move, don't escalate, don't give them a reason. I'm not doing anything, he said, clearly, into the translation matrix. I haven't done anything. Whatever you think is happening, it isn't. The guards held position, 6 of them in a semicircle around him, blades at the ready. The other 6 had moved to positions relative to the queen. The queen had not moved. She was still standing 3 meters from Marcus with her hands at her sides and an expression that was no longer almost smiling. It was something harder and more certain. She looked at Commander Varath. She said something sharp. The translation matrix didn't catch it clearly, angle issues with the audio, but the witnesses closest to her confirmed what she said later. She said, "Lower them." Varath did not lower them immediately. He held position for a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, which was, in that context, an enormous length of time. He was doing the calculation, weighing what he saw against what he feared. Then he said something to the queen, something very quietly, and she responded very quietly. Nobody in that room heard the exchange clearly enough to repeat it verbatim, but afterward, several witnesses described it as, she told him that she knew what she was doing, and that he should trust her judgment, and that the human was not a threat. Varath lowered his blade, the others followed. And the queen turned back to Marcus and said, through the translation matrix, "I apologize for my guards. They are protective to the point of," and then a pause while the translation processed a Vorathi idiom that doesn't have a clean equivalent, to the point of not always thinking clearly. Marcus lowered his hand slowly. He said, "No, they were right to react. I would have done the same thing." He said it without a trace of sarcasm. He meant it completely. And that was the thing that changed the room. Part 6, what MARCUS did next. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you something about Marcus Vale that the official record doesn't fully capture. He was not a hero. He was not trained for this. He was not some elite diplomatic envoy or military expert planted in the right place at the right time. He was a tired, hungry, slightly frightened man in wet boots who had spent the last 4 days doing his best with what he had. What he had was this: 32 years of being human, which includes all the history and biology and behavioral programming that entails. The specific capacity for a human being to look at a situation that is objectively terrifying and decide, not through calculation, but through something older and more fundamental, that the best response is to stay present, to not run, to not fight, to hold ground without making ground dangerous. Humans have been doing this for a very long time, in contexts far older than space travel. The Vorathi did not know this yet. They were about to learn. Marcus asked, through the translation matrix if he could speak freely. The Queen said yes. He said, I need you to understand something about my situation. I didn't come here on purpose. I crashed. My ship is in the mountains, about 11 kilometers up that road to the northeast of your city. I have no way to contact my government. I have no weapons beyond the knife at my belt, which I have no intention of using, and you can take it if it makes your people more comfortable. He reached to his belt with one hand, slowly, clearly telegraphing the motion, and drew the knife and held it out handle first. Nobody moved. He held it there for a moment, then placed it carefully on the floor in front of him and stepped back. He said, I am not a representative of the hegemony, not officially. I'm a licensed independent explorer, which means I'm accountable to hegemony law, but I don't speak for hegemony government. I can't make treaties. I can't make promises on behalf of anyone but myself. The Queen had not taken her eyes off him through any of this. He said, what I can tell you is that I don't want trouble. I want to repair my ship or find another way to contact my government and explain what happened. I want to do that as quickly and as cleanly as possible, without creating any more of a situation than I already have. And if there's anything I can do, information I can share, anything that's useful to you in exchange for your help, I will do that. He paused. He said, I know this is unprecedented. I know you didn't want this. I'm sorry I landed in your mountains. The silence in that room was very particular, not empty, full of 40 people processing at once, in subvocalization he couldn't hear but could now recognize as present by the faint movement in the room's frequency. The Queen looked at him for a long moment. She said, how long has your species been in space? Marcus thought about it. About 230 years since first faster-than-light travel, about 40 years since active deep space exploration at this range. How long did it take you, she said, to reach the technology you use now? He thought, depends on how you measure. If you go back to the beginning, first tools, first settlements, maybe 300,000 years. If you go from first industrial technology to first spacecraft, about 500 years. She was quiet for a moment. She said, we have been sapient for approximately 12,000 years. He was quiet too, then he said, that's a long time. She said, yes. She said, and in that time we have chosen not to reach outward. We have watched other species reach toward us and chosen to remain invisible. We are a patient people. He nodded, not speaking. She said, you are not what I expected. He said, I'm not sure what you expected. She said, something more. The translation matrix paused again on another idiom. Then it rendered, something more certain of itself. Marcus almost smiled. I've had a rough week. And Commander Verath, from his position by the throne, made a sound that was, the surveillance audio confirms this, a very short, very controlled version of a Vorathi laugh. Part 7, the negotiation that wasn't. What followed over the next 18 hours was not, technically, a negotiation. Neither Marcus nor the Queen had the authority to negotiate anything with any binding consequence. What it was, he said later, was a conversation. A very long, very careful, very significant conversation. They moved out of the throne hall after about 2 hours. To a smaller room, a chamber with furniture at a height where both a Vorathi and a human could actually sit comfortably, which Marcus was fairly sure had been arranged specifically, and the speed with which it had been arranged told him that the palace was extremely well organized and that people were paying very close attention to everything. Kithrin was there. Commander Verath was there, at a distance, by the wall, watching Marcus with the specific watchfulness of someone who has decided you're probably not a threat, but is not prepared to commit to that fully yet. 2 advisors whose names Marcus didn't catch clearly enough for the translation matrix to render precisely. And the Queen. Her name, or the approximation the translation matrix could render, was something that came out as Siren. He called her that. She didn't correct him. Later, Kithrin would explain that the full title is considerably longer, and that Siren was, in the old form of the language, the core of the name, the part that belongs to the person rather than the position. She was curious about everything. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected political caution, which was certainly present. He'd expected assessment, also present. But the quality of her curiosity was something else. It was genuine and specific, and it moved from topic to topic with a precision that made him realize she had probably prepared questions before he came into the room. She asked about the hegemony, what it was, how it functioned, how many species it included, what the power structure looked like. He answered honestly about what he knew, which was an informed layperson's understanding rather than a political expert's. She asked about Earth, what it was like, what the population was, what humans had done to it over those 300,000 years of being sapient. He told her the truth, the whole truth, including the parts that weren't flattering. She said, after he'd explained the last 2 centuries of Earth's environmental history, "Your species nearly destroyed your own world." "Yes," he said, and then stopped. "More or less it's ongoing, but yes." "That," she said, "is actually not common." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" She said, "In the 12,000 years we have observed sapient species in this part of the galaxy. From a distance, passively, we have seen the pattern you describe in 4 other species. A species that grows fast and damages its home world and then faces the question of whether to continue or to change." She paused. She said, "Most of them do not change." Marcus sat with that for a moment. She said, "Of the 4 we observed in that situation, 2 consumed their worlds and did not survive. 1 changed its behavior but lost so much that it never recovered capacity for expansion. 1," and here she paused again, and Varath by the wall shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. "1 changed and survived and expanded, and we chose, after careful consideration, to ensure they did not find us." Marcus was quiet. "That species," he said, "is it in the hegemony?" The Queen looked at him steadily. "Yes." He thought about that, about what it meant, what a 12,000-year-old civilization had seen, and decided about the various species that now made up the hegemony's membership, about the fact that they had chosen invisibility not from weakness, but from a calculation so long and patient it made the entire hegemony's history look like a single afternoon. He said, "What made you decide about humans?" "If you've been watching." She said, "We haven't been watching humans long enough. Your expansion into deep space is, by our timescale, very recent." She said, "You are, as I said, the first I have seen in person." He said, "And?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at him with those deep reflective eyes, and he said later that he felt like she was trying to see past his individual self to something behind or within it, the whole species, the whole story, compressed into one slightly disheveled explorer in a room he wasn't supposed to be in. Then she said, "You gave my guard your knife." He said, "Yes." "You held it out handle first." "Yes." "Why?" He thought about it. He said, "Because the situation needed the tension to go down. And I could do something about the tension, so I did." She was quiet. She said, "Most species in that situation would not have done that." "I know," he said, "but most species aren't human." Part 8, the thing about humans. I'm going to tell you what Commander Varath said in his testimony, because it's the part of this whole story that stays with me the most. Varath's testimony was taken 3 days after the incident, through a formal Vorathi hegemony interpreter who'd been sent the moment the hegemony found out what had happened. He was precise. He was economical with words. He gave you facts without embellishment, which is, in retrospect, why the embellishment-free account is so striking. He said, When the Queen approached the subject, I evaluated the situation as a potential influence event. This is protocol. The subject's response to the blade deployment was not consistent with a species acting under influence compulsion, which typically produces either aggressive counter-behavior or extreme passivity. The subject produced neither. He became still. He raised his hands. He spoke clearly. He did not attempt to use the weapon he still carried at his belt, which, I will note for the record, had a faster draw angle from his position than any of my guards' blades did from theirs. He said, "He was faster than us. He knew it. He chose not to use it. I have been a soldier of the sovereignty for 41 years. I have served in 17 conflict situations. I have seen species under threat. I have never seen a species under threat make a decision like that so quickly, so completely." He said. He put his knife on the floor. He said, "I have thought about this for 3 days. I think I understand it now, though I am not certain. I think he did it not because he calculated that it was the safest option, but because, in the moment, he decided that lowering the threat mattered more than his own safety." He paused in the testimony. He said, "That is a very specific kind of courage, not bravado, not calculation, something else. I do not have the precise word for it in our language." The hegemony interpreter noted in their margin comments. Commander Verath spent approximately 40 seconds in silence after the above statement before continuing. Verath's testimony concluded, "I believe the Queen's judgment was correct. I believe the subject is what he says he is, and I believe, for what my individual assessment is worth, that humans are worth paying attention to." I was in the debrief room when Marcus heard Verath's testimony read back to him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he noticed the draw angle. Lieutenant Commander Solly said, "Yes." Marcus said, "Did you notice it?" He looked at his hands. "Yeah." "And?" He shrugged. And it wasn't a conversation I wanted to have with a bunch of people whose names I didn't know, in a building I didn't have a map for, in a political situation I had no training for. Solly said, "So you made a choice?" He said, "I made the choice." There is a difference. He knew that, she knew that. I knew that, listening from the back of the room. The difference between a choice, one of several options, and the choice, the only one that made sense in the fullness of everything you are. Part 9, the morning after. Marcus slept in the palace that night. They gave him a room, not a cell, not a monitored space, just a room. Warm, quiet. The bed was built for a Vorathi body and was accordingly too large for him, but he managed. He said he slept better than he had in months. He didn't know why. The stress hadn't resolved. The situation was still complicated. He still had no way to contact the hegemony. But something about the meeting with the Queen had settled something in him. He said, and this is in the communicator record, right before the audio cuts out because the battery finally died, "I think we're going to be okay. I don't know who we is. Me and the ship maybe, me and the Vorathi, me and the whole damn galaxy. But I think we're going to be okay." In the morning, the Queen asked to see him again. Not in the throne hall. In something that functioned as a garden, an interior space with growing things, which given the season outside was a technical achievement, and the plants were unlike anything in the hegemony's botanical records. Deep purples and near blacks, geometric growth patterns that looked designed, until you realized they were entirely natural, just following a different evolutionary logic than Earth life or most other life he'd seen. She was walking when he arrived, moving between the plant rows with her hands behind her back in a posture that Keithrin, who'd brought Marcus down, whispered was how she thought. She turned when Marcus came in. She said, "I have made a decision." He said, "I'm listening." She said, "We will repair your ship. Our technicians have gone to it. They went overnight. The drive coil fracture is repairable. It will take perhaps 4 days. He said, "Thank you." She said, "During those 4 days you will remain here, not as a prisoner." As a pause, the translation matrix working as a guest of specific interest. He said, "I can live with that." She said, "When your ship is repaired, you will leave. You will file whatever report your laws require. You will tell the hegemony that you made accidental contact with the Vorathi sovereignty." He said, "Yes." She said, "And then the decision about what happens next belongs to forces larger than either of us." He said, "Yes." She looked at him. She said, "Does that concern you?" He said, "A little. I'd be lying if I said otherwise." She said, "What concerns you specifically?" He thought about it. He said, "I'm worried that when the hegemony knows about you, they'll push. They push. It's what they do. It's what we all do, really, this far out in space. We see something new and we want to understand it, and sometimes the wanting is fine, and sometimes it isn't." She said, "And you are worried we are not equipped to resist?" He said, "No, I think you're probably very well equipped to resist. I'm worried about," he struggled for it, "I'm worried about what it costs, on both sides. When the push starts and the resistance starts and nobody pauses long enough to just talk." She was quiet. Then she said, "You paused." He said, "I was terrified. Pausing was easy." She said, "No, it wasn't. That is exactly the point." Part 10, 4 days. The 4 days are documented in the most thorough section of the archive file, because during those 4 days, a significant amount was recorded by both Marcus's repaired secondary communicator. One of the palace technicians fixed it while working on the ship, and Marcus suspects this was intentional and approved, and by the Vorathi's own monitoring systems. What those 4 days contain, at the level of story rather than the level of diplomatic record. Conversations, long ones between Marcus and the Queen. Between Marcus and Kithrin, who turned out to have a very particular interest in the history of human legal systems, and spent 3 hours on the second day comparing Vorathi law structures with what Marcus could remember of Earth's various legal traditions. Between Marcus and the palace medical staff, who were deeply interested in human biology and extremely polite about it, taking samples only when he explicitly consented, and showing him the analysis in real time because they could see he wanted to understand. And between Marcus and Commander Verath. That one wasn't planned. It happened on the 3rd day in a corridor when Marcus was walking between his room and the garden for a meeting with the Queen, and Verath fell into step beside him without preamble. They walked in silence for about 30 seconds. Then Verath said, through the small personal translation device they'd given Marcus, "You were faster." Marcus said, "Yes." "I recalculated it several times," Verath said. "The angle and your reach versus the position of my guards. If you had drawn when they drew, you would have had a window." Marcus said, "I know." "You always knew." "From the moment they moved, yes." Verath walked in silence for another stretch of corridor. He said, "Why did you not take the window?" Marcus said, "Because winning that fight would have lost everything else." Verath said, "Most soldiers in that moment cannot separate the tactical from the strategic." Marcus said, "I'm not a soldier." Verath said, "No," and then, "That may be the explanation." They reached the garden entrance. Verath stopped. Marcus stopped. Verath said, "I want you to understand something." Marcus waited. Verath said, "My function, my entire life's work, is ensuring that the Queen is not harmed. That is not simply a job. It is the defining commitment of my existence. Every decision I make runs through that filter." He said, "When I gave the signal, I believed I was protecting her." He said, "I was wrong about the threat. I was not wrong to act." Marcus said, "I know." Verath said, "You said so in the throne hall." Marcus said, "I meant it." Verath studied him for a moment. Then he made a gesture, a two-finger press against the sternum, brief and deliberate, that Marcus later confirmed was a Vorathi gesture, meaning something in the range of acknowledgement between equals. He had not expected that. He returned it approximately, pressing two fingers against his own chest the way he'd seen it done. Verath turned and walked back down the corridor without another word. Marcus stood in the garden entrance for a moment. Then he went in to talk to the Queen. On the fourth day, the ship was ready. They walked up the road together, Marcus, Kithrin, Verath, two technicians, and the Queen. The Queen had decided, apparently, to see the ship herself. Verath had apparently decided that if the Queen was walking up a mountain road in the cold, he was going with her, and the expression on his face during this portion of the journey, which the surveillance drone that accompanied them captured in detail, was one of barely contained logistical suffering. The reluctant pilgrim looked worse than Marcus had left it. The trees it had gone through on the way down had left marks. One wing strut was still cracked. The technicians had reinforced it but couldn't fully repair it without materials they didn't have. It would fly, but it would need real work at the first hegemony station he reached. The Queen walked around it slowly, looking at everything, running her hand along the hull in one place. Not the damaged sections, just the clean hull plating, the way you run your hand along a surface to understand its texture. She said, "It is smaller than I expected." Marcus said, "Most people say that." She said, "You travel alone in this." He said, "Mostly." She said, "Is that by choice?" He thought about it honestly. He said, "At first, yes. Lately, not entirely." She looked at him. He said, "It gets quiet." She said, "Yes, I understand that." The way she said it made him not ask what she meant, because the tone was the explanation. They stood by the ship for a while in the cold, with the mountains around them and the pale green-gray sky above. Then Kithrin said something to the Queen that Marcus didn't catch, and she said something back, and Kithrin turned to Marcus and said, "She wants you to take something with you." Marcus said, "Okay." Kithrin held out a small object, flat, circular, about the size of Marcus's palm, dark metal with the same luminescent thread running through it that the Queen's robes had. Kithrin said, "It is not a communication device and it is not a weapon. It is a," and here the translation matrix paused for a long moment, "a declaration of status. If you carry it and any Vorathi sees it, they will know you have been received by the sovereignty and treated with respect." Marcus took it carefully. He looked at it, he looked at the Queen. He said, "This is a significant thing to give." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because whatever comes next, whatever the hegemony decides and whatever we decide, I want there to be a record that the first time a human stood before me, they chose not to be afraid." She said, "Or rather they were afraid, and they chose anyway." Marcus held the disc carefully. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Be careful on the way out. The atmosphere is rough in the upper band." He almost laughed. He said, "Gerald will complain about it." She said, "Your co-pilot." He said, "Navigation AI, long story." She said, "You told me. You named it after someone from an old Earth story." He blinked. "I know I didn't say that. I don't actually remember where I got the name." She said, "Perhaps you will figure it out on the way home." He got in the ship. The systems came up slowly, complaining about the cold and the damage. Gerald, the navigation AI, ran its startup sequence and produced an assessment of the drive coil that was, in its flat, toneless way, cautiously optimistic. Marcus sat in the pilot's seat and looked out the front screen at the group standing in the snow. Kithrin, the two technicians, Verath, who had his hands behind his back in a posture that was probably his version of at ease and was watching the ship with the focused attention of someone cataloging everything about it. And the Queen, who was looking at the front screen, looking at him. He raised one hand, a small wave. The kind of gesture that means goodbye in probably 100 different cultures across the galaxy because the underlying impulse, I see you, you see me, this matter doesn't need words. She raised one hand in return. Then he set the thrusters and lifted off, and the snow came up around the landing struts and then fell away, and the mountains dropped below him, and the pale green-gray sky wrapped around the ship and then thinned and darkened as he climbed through the upper atmosphere. And then, stars,